All right, so we are here with some of our Launch Academy staff to talk about the new Node curriculum that the 31st Boston cohort is currently undergoing. So we have a panel of different staff members here. I'm Alex, I'm the Career Services Manager, so I'm going to be kind of moderating a little bit. And then we have three other members of our staff here as well. Dan, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Hey everybody, I'm Dan Pickett. I'm one of the co-founders here, and I'm really excited to share some of the developments that we've had with the premiere of the new Node curriculum.
Awesome. Brianna, you want to go?
Yeah, so I am Brianna. I am the project manager for the development of the Node curriculum. So that's kind of been my main focus at this time, and it's exciting to see it going live and see how it's landing.
All right, and last but not least, we have Nick.
Yeah, my name is Nick Alberts. I am the Boston Experience Manager here at Launch Academy. So I'm overseeing the delivery of that Node.js curriculum and making sure that these students actually retain and develop some of these concepts on their own.
Awesome. So I guess to start us off, it would probably be helpful to give a little bit of context to why we're having this conversation, right? So Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of historically what the launch program has looked at like and why we're talking about this Node program and why this is something we're doing this year at the end of 2020?
Yeah, I think since our inception, we've always been very intentional about listening to the market, right? So whether it's from our hiring partners or from our students that are graduating and going into interviews, or even some of the consulting projects that we're taking on, we're kind of learning and always listening to what the needs are. And for whatever reason, we're seeing a lot of technologists and technology managers and product managers looking for Node as part of our launchers skill sets. And there's a certain amount of interest in having our students work with JavaScript, a programming language, in the programming language that we teach in the Node curriculum exclusively. Learning that language throughout the duration of the program, starting in Ignition all the way to the end of their Breakable Toy/capstone project. So, I think it was really a function of just kind of hearing the needs of the market from hiring companies, from students that are in interviews, and really just kind of keeping an eye on the trends of the industry and making sure that our students are always learning in-demand skills.
Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like, Launch has been for almost 8 years now a Rails program, right? We've had this kind of one primary Ruby and Rails curriculum that we've been teaching. And now that we've introduced this Node program, Brianna and Nick, you guys have been kind of instrumental in getting this off the ground. What would you say, Brianna, maybe you can start here, would be the big difference for somebody if they're unfamiliar with like the Rails program versus the Node program? What would you kind of say is the big difference between the two?
Yeah, so Dan already touched on the idea that there is something really nice about being in one language for the duration of the program, right? When we have the two languages, in a way, it can edify your understanding of how the coding languages in general work, and the two can play off of each other really nicely. But when you're just working with JavaScript, you have that opportunity to get really comfy with it and to kind of gain a deeper understanding of not just how to make it work, but how it is working behind the scenes. And I think that's something you have a little more bandwidth for when you're working with one main language. Beyond that, one of the things that we've noticed a lot in our consulting work, especially, which kind of like, informed the curriculum that we wanted to build, is that in the Ruby curriculum, we're teaching a framework called Rails, and Rails is known for being a very opinionated framework. There were rules for how you should make certain functionalities work, where the code should live, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a formula that you can follow, and that's the formula that you have. And breaking the rules can be pretty difficult and uncomfortable within that formula. In a Node environment, those same rules don't apply. And there's a reason for that Node developers wanted the ability to make an app exactly what they needed, no more, no less. The tricky thing about it is that there are fewer conventions in the industry, and it's all newer. So when you run into bugs, there's less documentation typically on what the bugs are. So it's young, like we as developers are still figuring out our footing in the Node environment, which is really cool and exciting. And we get to inform the decisions and conventions that are taking hold. But there's a little less guidance along the way. And so in our curriculum, we seek to decide on what that guidance should be for the beginners that we're teaching. But as Node developers, the students are going to have a little bit of a different experience as they enter just being beginner software developers.
Yeah, I mean, I can only add to what Brianna has basically said there, in that, currently the students are going through the program right now, and they're really doing an excellent job because they've had that level of immersion in the same sort of language domain throughout the program. They have been in JavaScript throughout the first phase of the program, the virtual phase, Ignition, and are still in that same domain now. Whereas in Rails, they're gonna come away using both JavaScript and Ruby, which allows them to be multilingual. But I don't want that. I remember when I was actually a prospective student at Launch Academy, and I labored over the difference between, oh, should I do a Ruby bootcamp or a JavaScript bootcamp or a Python bootcamp, etc. What's really the most important decision is that you choose to switch careers and invest in this skill set. Inevitably, you're going to see like pros and cons to both. I think, in my opinion, Node.js is going to be a lot more configurable and probably in some cases more performant. But because it is more bleeding edge, because it is newer, maybe you are going to have a few extra frustrations when you're in development mode with it. Whereas in Rails, because there is well-established conventions, as long as you're following those conventions, it's a speedier development process. So again, like, you have different options to choose from. Both of them are valuable, and both of them will give you the skill set to land a gig.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to note that the technologies that we use as software engineers are going to change routinely. That's the only thing that is certain in our industry. And so I think a lot of beginners are quite fixated on what technology to learn first. And I think the perspective of the entire team is just pick one, and go with it, and learn what you can of that language. And learning your second, third, fourth, fifth language is going to be immensely easier. It's just kind of getting over that first hump with whatever language you choose. It could be Ruby, could be JavaScript, could be Python. Some folks even start with Java, right? But the key thing is to just keep persevering and keep pushing with one language. Don't kind of go halfway and then decide, oh, you know what, maybe I'm just learning the wrong language. You're going to lose momentum and a sense of progress that way. So it's really important to just kind of pick one and stick with it. That being said, in our curriculum, for those that are doing the Rails orientation, as Brianna mentioned, there's really a great way for you to develop skill sets in two languages at once. And though it's a little bit jarring, kind of spending 2 weeks in one language, 2 weeks in another, what it does allow you for is sort of this compare and contrast framework. And you can kind of compare and contrast what Rails and Ruby are great at versus what JavaScript and Node are great at. And that really helps the early learner sort of build a mental model for programming languages more generally.
And I think that's a nice opportunity too to mention that there are a lot of similarities and overlaps between the two programs. We teach React in both of them, first of all. So, that right there is a pretty big similarity between the two. But even if the language or the framework is different, so many of the concepts of software development are the same. And we really try to bring a lot of the things that we believe in from our Rails curriculum into our Node curriculum. So that includes things like test-driven development, writing tests to make sure that your code is working the way you want it to work as you build it. object-oriented programming and a model view controller design pattern, even though it's not inherently necessarily built into Express apps, which is what we use to run servers. It's a pattern that you can still use within that framework, and that is the pattern we teach. Things like the single responsibility principle, the separation of concerns, ways to best organize your code to make sure that it is modular and reusable and other developers can find their way around it really well. These are themes that we make sure to keep consistent between the two programs. So even though we're using different tools, we're still learning the same concepts and the same approach to software development, regardless of the language we're working in.
I love that. It sounds like, we've kind of been referring to them as two different programs, but really it sounds like it's the same program. It's just the technology is slightly different, right? So a lot of those foundational concepts, a lot of the things that aren't directly related to that specific technology are the same between the two cohorts or the two programs, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about how this actually came together. So, again, like Launch has had 8 years now of a primarily Rails Ruby curriculum. And so I imagine developing a new curriculum is a challenging thing. So can you guys talk a little bit about how you went about starting this curriculum, how it was developed, and I guess just how Launch in general kind of goes about writing curriculum? And Brianna, I guess, do you want to jump in on this one too?
Sure. So yeah, we have been working to refine our curriculum development process over the years of Launch Academy. And there are so many different decisions that go into a new curriculum, especially in an environment like Node, where we have to decide, okay, if we were to pick conventions, what are we seeing out there in the wild the most? What do we think will benefit the students the most? That is where the consulting side of the business really benefits us. We get to see what works in larger scale applications and therefore determine, okay, what can we teach to the students in apps of the scale that they will be working in that will also allow them to have scalable applications and get used to patterns that they can continue to use even in bigger apps. But as far as the curriculum development goes, we really approach it in the same way we approach our software development. So we use agile methodologies. We use a project management software. We put in all of our stories. We first start to look at the big picture and say, okay, we have 14 weeks of curriculum all in between phase 1 and phase 2, and as well as the projects at the end. What are our learning goals? What do we want to tackle? And then from there, let's go backwards. Like, what is the final product we want them to be able to build? Now let's go backwards and break that down into the 2 phases. Okay, now let's break it down into kind of like units and then chapters, so to speak. So we're just breaking down the learning goals so that we can get to the end result. So that first top level look of the big picture and being able to build out stories for that and point those stories and figure out how much unknown there is in each of the things that we want to teach. What do we have to learn and research and figure out in order to decide exactly what we want to teach the students? And iteration is a huge part of that process. So even as we build out the curriculum, we run into situations where we realize, you know what, I'm trying to figure out how to teach this, and the way we were planning isn't actually working the way we were hoping it would. So then it's back to the drawing board. And that is where kind of having these encapsulated units, so to speak, can help, because we can say, okay, for the React weeks, let's say, this approach that we want to take, it's not working. Let's come back to the kind of initial planning team, figure out what we want the approach to be, adjust the stories that play into that accordingly, and then we can go back to our kind of flow development process. So that is a huge part of the curriculum development, is the ability to test as we go, get feedback as we go. We peer review all of each other's work so that we know someone is actually looking at this and reading it who isn't me and my brain. I can obviously understand what I'm trying to teach, but can someone else learn from it? That's a really important thing to know. So all of that kind of just getting feedback as we go and making sure we're willing to adjust as that feedback comes in is really crucial.
Before we go on to the next person, I'm sure Nick and Dan, you guys have things to add. I actually just wanted to ask a quick question. So, Brianna, you kept saying we, right? Like we do this, we do that. Who is we? Like who is actually developing the curriculum? I know you're a big part of that, but when you're talking about peer reviewing and stuff, who's actually writing the curriculum?
That is a great question. So we have whenever we take on some kind of new curriculum that we want to build, we have a team whose main focus it is. And so in developing the Node curriculum, I was kind of the person who was able to have full eyes on it. And the immersive team contributed really heavily to building out the curriculum as well. So Nick was heading the charge up over there, and we had Karen and Fang, who are two of our EEs on campus. They were writing curriculum as well. But in the initial stages, especially, it's important to have that team kind of making the decisions too, right? So for us in this project, it was me and Nick bouncing a lot of ideas off of each other as far as how things would land with the students. We consult with our consulting team and we get a lot of input from them as we go. We actually had Cassie from our consulting team write a couple of articles because it was something she was working in at the time, and she had the bandwidth and was able to at least give us a structure or an outline for things, which was super cool. So we're getting the input from someone who's actively working with this material every day. We're able to kind of massage it to make sure it's approachable for the students. And then the team who is actually working with the students is able to build the curriculum, which allows us to benefit from their firsthand knowledge of how the students tend to absorb information. It also allows them to feel really comfy with a new curriculum when they go to teach that curriculum because they are intimately familiar with it.
And I'll add on there, so prior to even being, in order to write the curriculum, which as Brianna has mentioned, like our immersive team has had a hand in as well, we had to actually get that, we had to get the knowledge firsthand. So each of our staff members that actually delivers the curriculum, each of the teachers that students actually are interacting with in the program have had experience, in this case, working in Node.js React applications and using the technologies that we are actually teaching, right? So we're not just coming in here, you know, being provided a curriculum and then being told, hey, you're a developer, you can teach it, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, it's, we've actually seen that experience firsthand. That informs the decisions that we make as we write that curriculum. And now we have had a hand in both using the technology and writing the curriculum that we inevitably end up delivering to the students. So we also have the sort of extra added benefit of sort of being very informed holistically about how all of it is going to come together and be able to, as Brianna said, sort of massage it and inform students about what they can expect in each week of the program moving forward.
I think what's really cool about that too is that in the teachers spending time working on full stack applications where they're using these technologies, they did have to learn it at one point too, right? And so in figuring out how to integrate these technologies in existing applications and how to build out features that are unfamiliar in the new framework, at least, the people who are teaching are getting the experience of being the student and having to figure out how they learn the thing, how they get up to speed on the technology and the concepts in order to apply them. And so much of that, I mean, I see it when I'm looking through an article or an exercise that someone else has written. So much of that shines through where it's obvious that they're almost speaking to the them of yester week or yester month or yester year. And incorporating what they needed in order to learn into what they are giving to the students.
And sometimes the curriculum just needs colorful examples, for instance. So we have lots and lots of references to magical creatures and star vessels, etc., as our nerdy sides poke through in some of that curriculum, I think.
Just to go back to process, I just want to kind of demystify it too. What's really neat about the process we employ is we actually teach it to our students. So if you're interested in agile methodologies and this idea of iterative development, peer review through GitHub pull requests, these are all techniques and strategies that we deploy in the latter half of the experience at Launch Academy too. So we kind of in the industry, it's known as dog fooding, where you kind of practice what you preach, right? And we apply that both to our internal software development and to our curriculum development. And that has a tremendous impact on how we deliver. So in addition to using the technology, we're using the techniques and the methodologies that we teach our students in small group projects. So I think it's really easy for somebody coming into the industry to say, hey, just teach me how to code. But so much of what we teach is the process of software development in building a product that is usable and beneficial to the world. So, learning to code is just a small aspect of what we all do as software developers.
Awesome. So we touched on this a little bit before, but I think Dan mentioned previously that, Launch has always approached kind of curriculum by seeing what's in demand and talking with, companies in the area and stuff. And so one of the nice things about Launch curriculum is that it is fluid, right? It's constantly changing. It's constantly adapting. It's not like a textbook where you get your edition and it's the same thing for 5 years and we don't change it. So obviously with a new curriculum like this, there's probably things that pop up and tweaks that need to be made on the fly as it's being used by students. So Nick, as the experience manager, the person that's kind of leading up the immersive team and the experience there, can you talk a little bit about how Launch Academy approaches tweaking the curriculum and seeing how it's working for students on the go and on the fly?
Yeah, I think Dan and Brianna have mentioned how iterative we are with our curriculum process. There's no curriculum that will sort of I think ever be 100% stable. And anytime we actually do encounter bugs, I, at least personally, because I just enjoy teaching, get very excited when in the middle of providing a presentation or a live code through some material, we encounter an error. Those errors are part of the job, right? So we get that opportunity to set expectations on the actual required professional skills you need in order to be a software developer. So if, for instance, one of our libraries starts spouting out errors and gets angry, then we can take a moment and go, hey, everybody, let's dig into this error. Let's evaluate the stack trace. Let's talk about what it means to actually debug an application, because you're never going to deliver the code perfectly on your first pass anyway. And you don't want to prematurely optimize as it is. So usually that provides us an opportunity to talk about some of these concepts. And I think it also allows students to actually give themselves a break during the program, right? So I think a lot of students that are switching careers entirely put an enormous amount of pressure on themselves. And this is a very intense and a condensed program, right? You are going to learn a lot of concepts and techniques very, very quickly. So if we are able to, one of our little mottos is show the ugly. If we're able to say, hey, it looks like one of the many, many different technologies that we are using just changed. Let's talk about that, but let's also talk about how these things will be inevitable, and let's plan on how to adjust for all of the changes that we'll inevitably encounter.
Yeah, one of the other things that I think is really important is we are relentless about student feedback. So when it comes to every article, every challenge, every exercise, there's a text entry at the bottom of every article in our LMS, our learning management system, that says, hey, what did you think about this article? Was it helpful for you? And was it clear? And the students are asked to rate and leave some comments on how that article, exercise, or challenge worked for them. So in the off season, we actually get 2 or 3 weeks at the end of every cohort to kind of refine and tweak and hone what we've built. We'll collate all of that feedback and identify what areas of the curriculum need to be improved, and we'll take that iterative process and roll out changes in response to that feedback. So we get sort of that per article, per challenge level of granularity, which really helps us when we're planning out curriculum upgrades.
And we also get feedback. So Launch Academy probably is maybe a little bit more well known, at least in the Boston area, for how hands-on we are with the students. Culture is a huge thing that we foster, of course, but actually the direct meetings that we have with students are very, very important to actually see how we can adjust on a per cohort basis to the learning needs of the students in that cohort. So this is a little bit away from the Node.js curriculum, but we are constantly having one-on-ones. So every single student is assigned a mentor who they are regularly meeting with, so that they can talk about the best ways that they can grasp the curriculum, but also so that they can actually, quite candidly, distribute feedback to us, right? So we need that firsthand perspective in order to deliver a remarkable experience. And so we're going to reinvest that back into the students by providing that really, really valuable one-on-one support during the program.
Wonderful. Brianna, did you have something you were going to say?
Yeah, I have one last note on just the idea of the different ways we get the feedback and how we make decisions according to that. Because obviously when you're testing a new curriculum, there are different kinds of things that could come up, right? And it could be something that has to do with the way we chose to configure an app. It could be, as Nick mentioned, something that has to do with a package we're using and the people who built that package changed that package, and all of a sudden it doesn't play nicely with the rest of our application. And certain things we have full control over or incomplete control over. But a big part of the process of handling bugs as they come up, or handling just like conceptual trickiness as it comes up, is making determinations as a team as to when and how we should best deal with that thing. So the team that is teaching this curriculum and I are meeting up every day and talking about how the curriculum is being received and what maybe isn't as clear as we would like it to be. And we're making decisions on a daily basis about what we need to fix or change in the moment to make things more clear to students, and what we can leave for the off season so that it's better for the next go round. So maybe there's something that, you know, we're able to talk about it in a certain way in person, but we'd love to bring some of that into the article so that the next students who read that, you know, have that context as well. So I think that's really worth mentioning and just talking about, is this idea of, again, kind of that iterative process of, okay, what comes up and what do we want to do with it, and talking about it as a team and figuring out how to prioritize it, and being flexible on how we can prioritize different things is a huge part of that.
Awesome. It's kind of cool to hear a little bit about what happens behind the scenes that students may not even know on a daily basis, right? So I think one of the things I've heard about through this conversation, just from hearing about the curriculum so far, is that Rails tends to be this thing. You talk a lot about Rails magic, right? Whereas like Node is something that it kind of leans more towards control over the design and the configuration, right? So can you guys talk a little bit about kind of the philosophies that informed how those two things separate? Because it sounds like a pretty different experience for a student, as opposed to saying like, you know, you're going to have a lot of control over how things are set up, as opposed to just like, it's don't worry about it, right? So can you talk a little bit about that a little bit?
So What I think is really interesting about our approach to teaching this material is that we always try to keep in mind that the beginner thrives with structure and being provided with some rules. If a beginner tried to hop into Node.js just as a coding environment and they decided I'm going to self-teach and figure out how to make this application, there were too many options. And I think it would be very easy to be overwhelmed or discouraged because there's not structure to the way in which they're learning it. And so where Rails is opinionated and we love some of those opinions, some people don't love some of those opinions, but we know what they are and we're able to work with them. With Node, we had to decide as a team what our opinions are. And it's a really interesting process because sometimes our opinions don't line up. Like there have been conversations where Nick and Dan and I will get in a room and one of us will say, I feel really strongly that it should be one way. And the other will say, yeah, but I kind of disagree. I don't think that's going to be accessible to the student or what have you. The nice thing is we were able to build in this time and this like kind of right from the start expectation that we're going to create a structure and we're going to test that structure as we build the curriculum and we're going to change it as we go. And so over the past couple of months, we've actually been refining a boilerplate application for monolith apps. So a Node.js Express backend and a React frontend. And we started with certain beliefs in place and we created this structure. And as we actually used it, we realized, you know, most of it works, some of it doesn't. We're going to have to change it up. It's a tool that we make accessible to our students and to the public. It's an open source boilerplate application. But it's something that has allowed us the sandbox or playground to be able to test things out, see how they're working, decide what our opinions are that we want to teach, and create that structure so that we can then say, okay, here it is. Now we're ready to hand this to the students. Are there other options for the ways to do this? Of course there are, but these are the ones that we, through our testing, have decided are the easiest for them to grasp from the beginning, the easiest to apply, the most scalable, et cetera, et cetera. These are the things we think will serve the students. So let's give them this structure so that they can move quickly in the direction of building applications.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up, like our apps are opinionated, right? Or the way that we teach these apps are opinionated. I don't see every single software engineer in the world saying, oh, wow, I really love every single concept that you were focused on. And part of that is because different developers are focused on different outcomes, right? Sometimes it is actually performance. Sometimes it is just the speed at which you can deliver features. And then, as Brianna mentioned, one of the things that we need to weigh when we are deciding to develop this curriculum is how grokkable is it by our students that are going through this very specific format of a program. But regardless of which one of these programs a student chooses, you are going to see a lot of consistent best practices regardless. And those best practices aren't even just necessarily opinions that or aren't just opinions. Sometimes they are actually widely held beliefs. And that's what we want to make sure that students are actually getting, sort of this meta level of concepts and design thinking that they need in order to successfully develop any web application that they will encounter and have to work in. Yeah.
Awesome. Can you guys just talk a little bit about like some of the technologies that are being taught in the Node program, what those are and what somebody can expect, you know, from a curriculum standpoint to learn technology-wise? And yeah, Nick, why don't you start us off?
Sure thing. Yeah. So let's see here. So generally speaking, quite candidly, one of the first technologies that students are actually going to be interacting with is the browser environment, the original environment in which JavaScript was made for. So they will, right out of the gate, be applying the coding concepts that they are learning in a sort of live browser. And then we very, very quickly introduce them to the Node backend environment. So and all of the sort of, which allows us actually to highlight the differences between those two different domains. So Node, for those that don't know, is essentially an environment in which to run JavaScript on the back end. And there's a lot more that can go into that. But that allows us to introduce another technology, Express. So whereas Rails, whereas Ruby has the Rails framework, or Python has the Django framework, one of the many frameworks available in JavaScript is Express, which is a very lightweight web server that interprets incoming web requests. So if you are navigating to some web page, you are making a request to some server somewhere. So students get to learn how to configure their own servers, manage the business logic, interpret the request that a user is making, retrieve and manage the data, and then display that on the page. So Express facilitates essentially, Express is the controller, essentially, or air traffic controller. And then the technology that we use that to interact with the data that's managed in an application, in this case is actually two technologies, connects and objection, which it just so happens are best friends. They love working well together. So both of them are query builders. They allow us to execute SQL queries against some database. So retrieve and manage and update and create data in a database somewhere. But we generally use connects for lower to the metal queries. So managing the structure of a database, essentially defining what rows and columns you want to have in your Excel spreadsheets in your database. And then objection serves as an ORM, an object relational model, that can abstract away some of the SQL that they would otherwise need to exhaustively write, and instead focus on sort of an object-oriented approach, again, to managing data. So those are some of the core technologies in the stack. There's, of course, also our testing technologies. So in this case, for unit testing, we're using Jest, which is a highly accessible JavaScript testing framework developed by Facebook. And that is also that has many concepts that are widely used across a lot of unit testing frameworks. And then finally, Cypress, which is actually domain agnostic, which is really cool. So it's acceptance testing. That is, it tests a user's experience as if they were actually clicking on a web page, right? And you can use that framework for testing Express applications, Rails applications, Java Spring applications. And as those tests are actually being executed, they give you live snapshots of what is happening in a simulated browser, and even a final video about what that test was actually clicking on, which is really exciting.
Awesome. So I guess to close out our conversation here, what would you tell somebody, if there's a potential student who's unsure of whether they want to enroll in the Rails curriculum or the Node curriculum, what would you tell that person? And Dan, why don't you start us off there?
Yeah, I think for me, it's don't wait, right? Both technologies are in demand. Both technologies definitely have a captive market for sort of developers coming in and finding gainful opportunity. I think people tend to get hung up on the technology, and we don't want that to be an impediment for anybody looking to change their career in software development. We love software. We love teaching the fundamentals of software development, knowing that the technology is going to change over time. So what you're going to be learning at its core, whether it's in Rails or in Node, the core is still going to be the same, and the fundamentals are still going to be consistent. It just is kind of like a different flavor on the same meal, so to speak. So, I would just encourage you to just get started and think about, how you can make the most of the time that you have. It's all about, in this industry, in my opinion, the opportunity cost. And the longer you wait, the more the technology is going to pass you by, right? So don't wait, get started, get invested in a technology and stick with that technology.
Yeah, and listen, I think the fact that we are doing the 2 cohorts back to back like that on a rotating schedule shows that we are invested in both of those technologies, and specifically that the hiring market is invested in both of those technologies. There are jobs out there that need both of these specific technologies and skill sets, and that's why we're rotating between the two. And so neither option is closing any doors to you. And I think it's really important as well to acknowledge that we have graduates who know Ruby and JavaScript and wind up in jobs where they're using Python and Java, like as Dan has mentioned in the past, we learn how to write software, we learn how to write code, we learn how to use a coding language, and so many of the concepts that apply to one coding language are going to apply to another. Learning your first one, that is the hardest step. Once you know how to learn that one language, you have kind of a skeleton upon which you can learn any other language. And from there, you are able to kind of grasp different syntaxes, et cetera, more easily because you already know those fundamental concepts. So the language that you are choosing to learn first will not close doors to you in the future. It will simply allow you to understand the coding concepts better so that then you can figure out, what paths are open to you and which of them you want to walk down.
Yeah, and inherent in choosing to be a software developer is choosing to also be a lifelong learner. As we like to say, like, this is your foot in the door, but you are going to have to learn an enormous amount more technologies, concepts, design patterns, professional skills in terms of working on a team even. This is step one, and it's going to get you your first entry-level software engineering job. But then after that, like you don't get to just be cozy. You get to, as long as you are hungry for it, continue to consume more of these different technologies and discuss and be a part of the way in which the whole industry moves forward, right? As a software developer, especially given how open source everything is, you are going to have a say in how even certain libraries and packages and even languages are used. So just take the plunge. Sometimes I like to say to the students, live the YOLO lifestyle, and dig in, and you'll be able to, do pretty much whatever you want after that. Be a mobile developer, be a web developer, work in DevOps, work more closely with databases. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do once you have that sort of foundational skill set.
I think too, what's really unique about the Launch Academy experience is that we give our students lifetime access to the curriculum, right? So if you can't decide between Rails or Node, know that when you graduate from one, you can study the other because you have access to both of the curriculum. So, that really affords you the greatest option, because if you decide that, maybe Node.js isn't for you after going through the program, the Rails curriculum will be sitting there waiting for you. And the concepts and the way in which we deliver that is going to be consistent with the way you learn Node. So we're really excited about this opportunity for alumni to be able to go back and kind of learn with us on a new technology, which is going to be really cool.
I think people often underestimate that they have access to the curriculum that even isn't written yet. When I went through the program 4 years back, I had no idea that there was also going to be a Node curriculum. I had an alum reach out to me last night who went through the program 3 years ago and needed Redux for an interview for a new position that they're looking to go to, reached out to me for assistance. And I said, hey, we have articles on that and we're able to send them to this person. And so I think often people just think, oh, sure, I have lifetime access, but how much am I really going to use it? But when you need it, it is there. And the fact that curriculum is coming out on new technologies as they become more popular in the industry is really, really valuable.
Awesome. That's a really nice resource to have. All right. Well, I think that'll do it for us. So thank you guys for being here and giving us a little bit of insight into this new curriculum and walking us through some of the really interesting facets of it and how Launch approaches it.
Yeah, if you've watched this to the end and you're sort of getting interested in Launch and excited about what we're doing here, let us know either in the comments or you can always email us at hello@launchacademy.com. We want to be doing sort of more of the behind the scenes, sort of giving you a picture and perspective of what the Launch Academy experience is all about. So if there are specific things that you'd like to see us do a video about, give us a shout and let us know and we'll make it happen.